Chapter 8, the Edo period, also known as the Tokugawa period, begins in 1600, ends not in 1853 as your book says. Cross that out and replace it with 1867. At the top of your page here is the crest of the Tokugawa family. This is the Aoi plant, or the hollyhock. And as always, it begins with the historical chronology at the bottom of your page, just very briefly. 1603 is when Tokugawa Ieyasu assumed the title of shogun at Edo. Also the same year, early kabuki with women performers emerges. 1609, the Dutch factory is established at Hirado. 1614 to 15, we have the Battle of Osaka. Ieyasu is victorious. 1616 is the death of Tokugawa Ieyasu. 1636 is the ban on Japanese travel abroad, thus beginning the period known as the Sakoku. 1637, Christianity is eradicated following the Shimabara massacre, or the Shimabara rebellion it's sometimes referred to as. 1637 is when Christianity disappears from the face of Japan, with the exception, of course, of the Kakure Kiristan, the hidden Christians. 1638, Portuguese traders are forced to leave Japan. 1641, the Dutch traders are transferred from Hirado to Deshima, so only the Dutch are allowed to remain at this designated area in Deshima. 1657 is the Great Fire of Edo. Compilation of the Dai Nihonshi, or the History of Japan, is begun. 1694, Matsuo Basho, the great haikai poet, dies, and we've read several of Matsuo Basho's works, of course, in other classes. You want to look up my videos on those as well. 1720, the relaxation on the ban on the importation of Western books, Christianity-related books, which are still banned during this period. So medical books and science books are allowed to come in, trickle in slowly, beginning in this year, 1720. 1774, we have the first Japanese translation of a Dutch book. 1804, we have the arrival of Rezanov, the Russian envoy. 1825 to 42, we have the exclusionist policy reinforced. The Sakoku policy is reinforced here during those 17 years. 1837, we have the rice riots in Osaka. The U.S. ship called the Morrison visits Edo Bay in that same year, 1837. And in 1853, we have the famous arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry at Uraga. So these are this is the basic outline of the period, and we will discuss some of these events in more detail in the course of this chapter. Early trade expansion is followed by the closing of the country, known as Sakoku. Christians are persecuted and expelled from the country. Isolation, or Sakoku, from the world brings peace and a thriving culture at home. The kabuki theater, haikai, it says haiku poetry here, but really technically it's haikai. Floating world pictures, known as ukiyo-e. The Tokugawa family rules effectively during this period, but prosperity eludes the nation. We have several famines during the Tenmei period, for example, in the 1780s and 90s. Some peasant rebellions kind of mark this period as well. The slight opening to the west begins as well with a Dutch trading post, allowing the infiltration of their ideas that stir the imagination of young Japanese. So that's just a basic kind of outline of this period. Moving on to the next page, image number 79. Here we have men hauling a large stone, or ishibiki zu ema. In that tablet we see a stone for castle wall is being carried out on a cart while workers help bullocks to move the load. A boy atop a stone sings a folk song. Isolation and progress. The Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan effectively and peacefully for 265 years. The shogunate turned away from foreign adventures and, except for a brief period at the beginning, kept foreigners and foreign influence out of Japan, using the time of long isolation for internal consolidation. The shogunate was founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu in 1603. Having come to power through military conquest, the shogun rewarded his supporters with extensions of their domains. But enemies were treated with consideration and allowed to occupy less productive areas in remote regions. They were known as the outer lords. The central government divided the country among some 250 feudal lords, known as daimyo. We've already encountered this term in previous chapters. And each of these daimyo was required to spend a portion of the year at Edo, the new capital, which later became known as Tokyo, of course. To reduce the possibility of conspiracy, all of these daimyo lords were forced to leave their families as hostages throughout the year. The emperor and his court were allocated adequate revenues, and the Tokugawas never sought the throne for themselves. But the emperor's functions were confined to traditional ceremonial and religious leadership. To discourage any attempt at imperial restoration, a Tokugawa garrison was was maintained near the imperial quarters. No vassal was allowed to approach the emperor except through a Tokugawa intermediary. And here at the top of your page, we have image 80. This is the Tokaido Emakimono. There we see Ieyasu rebuilt this castle in Edo in the 17th century. Feudal lord approaches the castle in the picture, followed by his samurai who serve under him. And we have a detail from that same emaki at the bottom of the page here. One of the many stations on the Tokaido Road to control traffic to and from the capital is depicted here. A small tea house, or chaya, awaits the travelers. The lords, or daimyo, were generally free to operate their fiefs without interference so long as they remained loyal to the shogun. The edicts forbidding non-military classes from carrying arms were continued from the Momoyama period, and you'll remember that we've discussed this already in the Momoyama chapter, how military arms and weapons were banned for non-military, non-bushi classes, as were the laws prohibiting change of occupation. These were all continued into this period. While Buddhism continued to be influential, Confucianism, or more technically Neo-Confucianism, known as Shushigaku in Japanese, with its emphasis on ethical conduct, made strides among the scholars, the intellectual classes, the intellectual leaders, and even among the bushi warriors, scholar warriors, you might translate bushi or samurai as. Indeed, the samurai used this extended time of peace to add intellectual attainments to exercise of military skills. The famous code of the Bushido, or the way of the samurai, way of the warrior, combining Confucian morality with traditional bravery and loyalty, was designed to stress responsibility of the Bushi samurai to his emperor and to the state. The fate of the Christian converts, however, was anything but peaceful. Continuous persecutions were the rule, and after a Christian-led peasant rebellion in 1636, the Shimabara rebellion that I just mentioned earlier, Christianity was completely eradicated. The Portuguese and the Spanish were also banished in the wake of this Shimabara massacre. However, a window was left open to the west. A tiny enclave of Dutch traders was allowed, Dangoku is the word in Japanese, for the Dutch, Amsterdam, Dutch traders were allowed to occupy an outpost at Deshima in Nagasaki harbor and to carry on limited trade with carefully licensed Japanese. Through this opening came a slow trickle of Western knowledge. As peace continued through the 18th century, the status of the merchant class, so you remember there are four major classes in the Confucian hierarchy, and this is imported to Japan and becomes sort of solidified during this early Tokugawa period. The shonin at the very bottom, however, they begin to rise during this period in status and they acquire more and more wealth, and this displeases the samurai class, of course, who want to keep them at the bottom. As peace continued through the 18th century, the status of the shonin, or the merchant class, improves, and a renaissance in literature, the theater, and the arts spread from the capital to the country. And some of the major names of this period, Ihara Saikaku, of course, and some other important writers we will address in our literature classes. There was time to cultivate the Japanese love of elegance and outward enjoyment of living. Isolation, instead of stifling the arts, gave the arts an impetus. There was a considerable increase in the number of volumes printed and read in Japan. Early newspapers printed from tile blocks gave accounts of battles and natural disasters. These were soon followed by the extensive development of woodblock prints and gave rise to genre painting, which recorded in detail the life of people on all social levels. But as the new culture expanded, there was a continuing regard for the early art of the country, which was rarely equaled by the new. During the final years of isolation, the Russians, Americans, British, and French knocked impatiently on the closed door of Japan. Within the nation, there were stirrings of scholars and intellectuals. The little that had trickled in through the open window at Nagasaki had created a thirst for more knowledge of the world, and a highly developed civilization was ready to receive it. Tokugawa Ieyasu, and image number 81, we have the Tokugawa Ieyasu Zo. Tokugawa Ieyasu, after fighting through the bloody wars that rocked Japan at the end of the 16th century and seeing the effects of Japan's defeat in its attempt to invade Korea and China, the new shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, was determined to follow a course of peace and unity. A big, heavy man, short and sturdy, he lived most of his life on horseback. Ieyasu was nonetheless intensely interested in books. He once said, quote, "If we cannot clarify the principle of human relations, society and government will become unstable, and disorders will never cease. Books are the only means whereby these principles can be set forth and understood." Ieyasu adopted a Confucian code of ethics, or Neo-Confucian, or Shushigaku code of ethics, although he remained a devout Buddhist throughout his life and expanded his beliefs to include the native kami, or deities of Shinto religion, whom he regarded as manifestations of the Buddha. Confucian philosophy, or Shushigaku, Neo-Confucian philosophy, served him as well. for his first interest was an orderly country under the direction of an orderly government. Unlike Hideyoshi, his predecessor, or Hidetada, his successor, Ieyasu did not enforce the edicts against Christianity with vigor. For a short time during his regime, more Christians actually infiltrated Japan, and certain churches were rebuilt. In a discussion with his ministers, he remarked that one maxim had served him well: requite malice with kindness. Enthusiastic about foreign trade, which flourished during his regime, he was reluctant to take measures to isolate the country. Most of the edicts closing off foreign trade and forbidding the Japanese to travel abroad were promulgated after his death. That's a very important point, underline that. During the latter years of Ieyasu's life, he retired to Shizuoka Castle at Tsuruga. Always an outdoor man, he said he loved Tsuruga because of the magnificent view of Mount Fuji and the opportunity for good hunting. So in the portrait, again returning to this portrait on the right, the Tokugawa Ieyasu-zo, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, is pictured there. He is, of course, famous for having unified the country and bringing peace after the death of his predecessor Hideyoshi. Upon his death, one of the greatest Shinto shrines in all Japan was raised in his memory, the Toshogu at Nikko. It was dedicated to him as architect of Japan's most lasting peace, the Buddha incarnate, and the sun god of the east. The country opened. At the top of this page, we have image number 82. This is Sueyoshi's junk, Sueyoshi Bune Ema. In the earliest years of the Tokugawa shogunate, Japanese ships carrying vermilion stamped trading permits traveled freely throughout Asia, making trips to Macau, Luzon, and innumerable Chinese ports. As soon as Korea had recovered from the unsuccessful invasion by the Japanese, trade was reopened with that country. 300 Korean envoys were royally feted as they traveled from station to station up the Tokaido road. Chinese and Portuguese traders were welcomed. From the Portuguese, the Japanese learned all they could about map making and navigation. These excellent sailors also acted as pilots on Japanese ships. And the inscription for this Sueyoshi Bune Ema reads, "Before the closing of Japan to foreigners, small ships such as this little junk ship traded with many Asian countries. Portuguese pilots were employed whenever available." And at the bottom here of this page on the right, we have image number 83. This is a scroll of Chaya's junk. Nakajima Shinroku Toto Kochi Kozu. Ieyasu, the first Tokugawa shogun, made friends with a young and ingenious Englishman named Will Adams, who landed in Japan in the year 1600. Will Adams, a pilot and gunner, became a trusted aide to Ieyasu and did much to improve the budding Japanese navy. Will Adams later wrote that the Japanese were good by nature, courteous beyond measure, and valiant in war. Confucian ethics, which dominated trade, confirmed the good opinion held by Will Adams. Ship owners and crews were required to swear an oath that they would abide by a policy of fair dealing that forbade excess profit-taking and exploiting differences in nationality, and that enjoined equal treatment for all and a respectful attitude toward the traditions of other countries. There were some disadvantages to foreign trade of which the Tokugawa shogunate was conscious. Piracy was rife throughout the Asian waters. Smuggling was commonplace, and during this period many Christians entered the country illegally. Slowly, distrust of Christian motives developed into an overwhelming fear of domination by the Spanish and the Portuguese. And the inscription for this image, number 83 at the bottom, reads, "Overseas colony founded by Japanese shows custom house and a marketplace." Moving on to the next page, on the left side we have image 84. This is cormorant fishing screen, or ukaizu byobu in Japanese. And just very briefly, the inscription for this byobu by Kano Tanyu reads, "The nobles fishing with cormorants. The birds have a cord around their necks, preventing them from swallowing the fish." The country closed. The thought, said to have been expressed by a Spanish trader, that Christianity was a springboard for military expansion and domination may have contributed to the expulsion of the Spanish and the Portuguese from Japan. Christianity at this time was militant throughout the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and Japanese converts may have exhibited political tendencies at home. Certainly suppression and even martyrdom did not affect their ardor. Between 1613 and 1626, it is estimated by the Church that 3,125 Japanese Christians suffered martyrdom at the hands of the government rather than give up their faith. That's an important figure, underline it. 3,125 between 1613 and 1626. An indication of how strong was the fear of dominance by the Christians was the oath required of Japanese who renounced Christianity. It included a section confessing that the Christian church could do what it liked with its people by threatening excommunication and hellfire, and that it was really a plot to take over the countries of others. Climax of the suppression of Christianity came when 37,000 Christian-led peasants rebelled in Shimabara. This is the Shimabara Massacre, the Shimabara Rebellion. The shogunate acted quickly. The resulting battle became a massacre. This was the end of Christianity in feudal Japan. And here we have, at the bottom of the page, image number 85. This is the Kujira Emaki, or the whale scroll. It depicts Kujira hunting that was prevalent during the Edo period. Early restrictions isolating the country decreed death to the crews of Portuguese or Spanish ships touching on Japan. Edicts followed prohibiting all foreign travel by Japanese under penalty of death. The building of ships large enough to engage in foreign trade was prohibited. In addition to the Spanish and Portuguese, English and Russians were also excluded. Only a few Dutch and Chinese traders were allowed to remain. Foreign books were forbidden. A choice, it was felt, had to be made between the assurance of internal peace and unity by closing the country or inviting dissension and unrest through intercourse with foreign nations. The Tokugawa shogunate, of course, chose isolation after the Shimabara rebellion in particular. And page 85, we have two more details from this Kujira Emaki. On the left side, we have 3 recently caught whales are being processed by swarms of busy villagers. According to a Japanese proverb, when one whale is caught, it makes 7 villages prosperous. On the right side, we see a winch is being used to pull a whale jaw across the beach. The new economy. At the top of the page, we have image 86. This is Sado Kozan Emaki, or the Sado gold mine scroll. We see gold being washed at the shogunate mine on Sado Island in the Nihonkai or Japan Sea. Gold was discovered by the mid-8th century. And at the bottom we see a detail from that same emaki, and here we have gold ingots being reduced for marking. At the right, coins called the obang and kobang are being stamped and weighed. As the cities of feudal Japan grew, conflict arose between the rice economy of the country and the money economy of towns, which developed with the growth of the shonin, or the merchant class. These tradesmen, or shonin, were taxed unmercifully. Nevertheless, they prospered. Some were permitted to improve wasteland by the shogunate. This was only one of the many breaks in the feudal wall. Uprisings of peasants, ikko-ikki, this is referred to ikko-ikki, peasant uprisings caused by the unequal distribution of wealth, and minor revolts against individual lords were other straws in the wind. The position of the bushi, or samurai, and there were a great many of them, became especially difficult. The samurai was a warrior without war. Because he had been elevated to a higher social status, he tried to maintain the appearance of prosperity, but his pay was small, and he was forced to look elsewhere for an income. The shoguns and feudal lords gave what help they could. They declared moratoriums on samurai loans, but at the same time they sometimes were forced to reduce stipends to their loyal retainers. These measures were not effectual, but many samurai showed unexpected resourcefulness. They became students, writers, artists, teachers, politicians. Some, to survive, became innkeepers, artisans, and agricultural workers. The Tokugawa government, with a growing need for more money to support an increasing standard of living, began to move toward a centralized government and away from feudal structure. In spite of occasional localized riots, no attempt by the masses to change the government was possible, but the students, merchants, emerging bankers, and young intellectual leaders could. Toward the end of the Tokugawa regime, the shogunate issued a wave of new edicts, including censorship, abolition of guilds, recoinage of money, and new tax levies on tradesmen. But they did not stick. There seemed to be a growing awareness, even within the government, of the necessity for change. And that change came, of course, with the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry. On the next page, we have 2 more details from this same Sado Kozan Emaki. And here we have underground operations and mines are revealed in the unique scroll pictured here. The artist uses cutaway technique to reveal various underground operations. White silver bearing ore is being removed from the mine in buckets shown on the far right. Next page, we have image number 87 here, the view of Nagasaki Harbor, or Nagasaki Kozu Tsuitate. This is a portable partition. Portable partition is the English translation for tsuitate. This is a word that you find in art descriptions quite often. Tsuitate, it's a portable partition. And in that image, we see the artificial island of Deshima, in the left center, in Nagasaki harbor. The Dutch were forced to move to this isolated trading post. And just briefly on the right side, taking up the entire page, we see a colorful Dutch ship showing 7 exposed guns anchored in this Nagasaki harbor. The landing party is preparing to go ashore. And this image is the Oranda Sen Nyushinzu, a woodblock print from late Edo period, translated as the Dutch ship entering Nagasaki harbor. The Dutch influence. The Western influence of Japan that was later to have a distinct effect upon the weakening of the feudal Tokugawa government began before that government was formed. 2 men, an Englishman, Will Adams, whom we've already discussed, and a Dutchman,
Jan Jostan van Lodestein,
were shipwrecked along the Japanese coast. Both found favor with the Tokugawa Ieyasu, who was then coming to power. When members of the Dutch East India Company sailed into Japan, Ieyasu let them set up a trading post. He suggested Uraga, near the capital of Edo, but the Dutch preferred to be far away from the center of government, and they settled at Hirado, near Nagasaki, instead. The Dutch built sturdy, square stone warehouses and living quarters in contrast to the delicate wood structures of local citizenry. On the edge of the harbor, they constructed the first lighthouse in Japan, a stone tower where fires could be lighted to guide their ships into the settlement. Traders from China, Korea, and even from the British East India Company visited this trading post at Hirado, but it was not destined to become a permanent trading colony. Difficulties arose first with the Spanish and then with the Portuguese, who were banished ostensibly for their efforts to spread Christianity. After the edict closing the country, the Dutch, along with some Chinese and Korean traders, were moved to an island off the coast of Nagasaki called Deshima. And here on this page we have image number 89, an elephant and a westerner, Zo to Sei Yojin no Zu, woodblock print. In that print we see an elephant imported by Dutch merchants as a gift to the shogun was not accepted. The first example of ukiyo-e showing a foreigner. And this main image in the middle is image number 90, Deshima off Nagasaki. Rosia Shisetsu Dezanofu Daiko Emaki. And you see the Russian ship coming into the Deshima harbor there. The British returned to Japan more than 150 years later when they were at war with Holland. 2 British ships, the Charlotte and the Maria, entered Nagasaki harbor, but a strong Dutch leader, Hendrik Doef, refused to surrender Dutch trade rights to the British. As a result of this visit by the British and another threat in 1824, the shogunate ordered all foreign ships driven away, uchi harai. The death penalty was usually meted out to the crews. Okay, that paragraph was a bit of a digression, jumping up to 1824, now back to the 1720s. Young Japanese, curious about the West, began to reach out for new knowledge. Their story is a highly dramatic one that begins when interpreter students learn to read forbidden Dutch works. During the early days of the Tokugawa shogunate, all foreign books had been banned, but this edict was raised in 1720 on books that were not concerned with Christianity. Christianity-related books were still banned, but other ones were allowed to begin trickling into the country. The first students to take up Dutch had an extraordinarily difficult time, first laboriously learning the language, then struggling with the problems of fitting Western ideas into the Japanese language and thought patterns. Books were passed surreptitiously from scholar to scholar, and often entire volumes were copied by hand. Even after the ban on foreign books was lifted by the shogun Yoshimune, students faced major problems in their attempts to adapt Western scientific knowledge to Japanese use. Their first efforts were put into the study of mathematics and navigation. Some scholars felt that knowledge of navigation and astronomy was essential for Japan's future. By the middle period of the Tokugawa shogunate, a conviction was spreading that if the country was to progress, it had to break out of isolation. Such ideas were contagious, and the small group of Dangaksha, or Dutch scholars, grew in knowledge and in influence. In 1774, the first book on European ideas written by a Japanese was printed in Japan. Other books followed, on military and naval matters, medicine. The students once dissected the corpse of a criminal by following the illustrations in a Dutch book, and geography. Okay, in that middle page here, on page 198, we have on the left side image number 91, scroll of the Dutch trading post at Dejima, or Dejima Kang Zukang, and in that Zukang we have A billiard game is in progress at the Dutch settlement. Japanese artists used modified bird's eye view technique in order to illustrate the house interiors. On the right side we see the Komojinzu in Japanese. Komojin is the Japanese word at the time for the Dutchman, and we see the portrait of a resident manager at the Deshima trading post. This picture is a portion of unique collection owned by the Japanese Kobe Museum. At the top of the image on the left we see gaily dressed Dutch foreigners are dining while their children play in the street below. Turkey and young bull were imported. Dutch brought servants from Southeast Asia. So you can see their servants in one of the rooms. Okay, on the next page we see image number 93. This is Jan Koch Blomhoff family, the Blomhoff Kazokuzu Tsuitate. And in that portrait we see the violating the rule against European women in the Dutch colony. Jan Blomhoff arrived with his family. They were all expelled. The growing fund of knowledge gleaned from the Dutch was only a very small part of the scholarship extant in Japan at the time. Young samurai and religious scholars, after studying their own history and that of England and China, were also looking forward to the time when Japan would play an important role in international affairs. The Dutch traders at Deshima led the same kind of life as they enjoyed in Holland. Tables, chairs, beds, and kitchen utensils were imported for their quarters. Even billiard tables were imported in an attempt to make life pleasant. Their greatest hardship was isolation. The man-made island of Deshima, constructed in Nagasaki harbor under the direction of the shogunate, was designed deliberately to keep them from contacting with the Japanese people. The authorities wanted, among other things, to prevent the fathering of children of mixed blood. Yet the Japanese adamantly refused to allow the traders to send for their wives from Holland. When one Dutch administrator, as I just mentioned, Jan Koch Blomhoff, brought his wife and children and their nurse, they were promptly deported. The Japanese seem to have been fortunate in the type of men selected to direct the Dutch merchants. Dr. Engelbert Kempfer, this is a very important name that often comes up in history books, was an author as well as a doctor. Isaac Titsing, who headed the post in 1779, was a distinguished scholar and diplomat. Dutch scientific knowledge went into the building of boats and forts and the casting of cannon by the Saga domain. A foundry and gunsmithy were constructed by the Japanese from Dutch models. And here on the right we have image number 94. This is Nanjin to Nagasaki Yujo no Zu. So here a young Dutchman is cavorting with a young courtesan. When Japan finally opened its doors to the West, it was the Dutch traders and the Japanese scholars who had learned so much from them who paved the way for a comparatively smooth transition to a modern state. Floating World. Image 95, street vendor of illustrated books. Ezoshi Iroiro is the title in Japanese. And in this painting we see a book vendor carrying her wares to a prospect who is being massaged. Publishing flourished during the Edo period, of course. There is a Japanese word that means many things to many people. The word is ukiyo. The origin of this word is uncertain, although today we probably can track it down to see when it was first used. Most Japanese think of it as a way of life, while most Europeans think of it as a woodblock print. It means both. For the work of the artists of this period became known throughout the world as ukiyo-e, floating world pictures. Once the word ukiyo-e had a sad connotation. So if you read literature and diaries and monogatari and so forth from the Heian period and the Kamakura period, ukiyo-e has a sad connotation. The implication of the word uki, or floating, changed, however, from transient or impermanent and therefore sad to lively and gay. And with this came a connection with the gay life of the time. Okay, so it says here that uki was always written with the character floating, but in fact it was originally written with the adjective ui, which means like melancholy. So there was a change at some point. I don't know the exact date, but ukiyo-e, ukiyo. This turnabout occurred near the end of the 17th century, which also saw a new type of literature based on the novels of Ihara Saikaku, who I've already mentioned, a new form and content in poetry, the haiku it says here, but cross that out by haikai, namely that developed into a fine art by Matsuo Basho and other Buson and other writers, and an evolution in the kabuki theater from simple dance performances to full-blown complex dramatic plays. This renaissance in the arts, much of it took place during the Genroku era, which is one of the minor eras, one of the major eras within the Edo period, along with Tenmei and several others, which were very important culturally, even brought new and colorful designs to household decoration and clothing. Much of this resulted from a gradual increase in educational materials. Popular authors and talented artists brought books within reach of an ever-increasing audience. So the emergence of a mass popular audience comes into fruition during this period as well. The arts were removed from the exclusive province of the nobility and spread over the countryside. And of course, the Edoites are known for their super high literacy, their familiarity with the classics, all the way down in the ranks to the merchant class as well. Next page, image 96, the Kabukizu Byobu. And there we see Kabuki theater. Before, women were forbidden to appear. So there were several women on stage, you will note. After the banning of women from the Kabuki, female roles were all performed by men, known as the Onnagata. The orchestra is seated above, women, nurses, baby at the lower right in the audience. Kabuki. From the austerity and understatement of the religion-oriented No plays and the romantic dramas of the Jōruri puppet theater came the highly realistic form of theater called Kabuki. It soon became the most important form of entertainment in Tokugawa, Japan. Elaborate and romantic dramas were enacted on huge stages. Movable scenery, special lighting effects, and ingenious use of theatrical illusion made possible the staging of fires, hurricanes, and snowstorms with telling effects on the audience. Kabuki plays included dramatic incident, music, and dance. Costuming was always fresh and brilliant. Female performers were forbidden entirely in 1629, underline that. And the government later proclaimed that only adult men known as onnagata, female impersonators, should play women's parts. Actors developed large followings, and every Edoite had his favorite actor. Artists sold thousands of theatrical portraits. The plays became more complex and acting more subtle in the Kabuki theater during the Genroku era, at the end of the 17th century. So I forget the exact dates, we'll look these up later, but the Genroku era I think is 1680s, for about a decade or a little bit longer than a decade. Most plays, however, still dealt with heroes, loyalty, and tragedy. Perhaps the most successful and most frequently performed of all the Kabuki plays was the story of the 47 Ronin, or masterless samurai Ronin. It tells of the lord who, after being insulted, draws his sword and wounds his foe. In this peaceful period, it was a capital crime for a sword to be drawn within the confines of the shogun walls. And here at the bottom, I think it's a detail from this byobu on the left side. Kabuki actors are applying makeup and donning costumes for performance of a heroic drama. The dressing room is portable, you will note. The unhappy man in this tale of the 47 Ronin is forced to commit formal suicide, but the instigator of the affair, Lord Kira, goes free. 47 of the deceased's retainers, now masterless men called Ronin, swear to avenge their lord's death by killing Lord Kira, who is allowed to go free. The suspense builds as they plan their revenge. One winter morning, with dramatic snowfall effect, they gain entry into Lord Kira's villa, cut off his head, and take it to their master's tomb. Dramatically, after making peace with the dead, they commit themselves to the shogunate for justice. Now the plot becomes purely Japanese after this point. Two arguments are advanced. One, that they should be pardoned, and two, that only a sentence of honorable suicide would satisfy the law and also the unspoken wishes of the Ronin. Having avenged their lord, it is argued, they would want to join him in the world beyond. The latter argument seems proper to the shogun, and all of the Ronin commit mass seppuku. Okay, so here we have several images on this page. Image number 97 at the top. This is a view of the Kabuki performance, Uki-e Shibai Goya. In that portrait we see 18th century Kabuki drama about the vendetta by the two brothers. Artist shows strong Western influence. The perspective style that was developed in the West and during the Renaissance is developed in Japan during this time. This is, I think, the word in Japanese, enkinho. And at the bottom we see image number 98, sumo wrestler Sekitori-zu. And there we see three sumo wrestlers wearing the traditional mawashi fringed half skirt. Calligraphy gives names of the champions. And on the right side we see this very famous portrait of actor impersonating a woman. The yakusha-e is the title in Japanese. And in that portrait we see a famous female impersonator. Onnagata is one of the series by Sharaku, whose career lasted 1 year. I don't know about that. Let's check on that. Next page, image number 100. Here we have a picnic screen, Yurakuzu Byobu. And in that portrait, we see a picnic party in cherry blossom time. This group carries a lunch box and a musical instrument called the shamisen. You see the shamisen there on the left. The man is playing the shamisen as they have their nice little picnic. And at the bottom, we see, I think it's a detail from that same byobu. Setting out on a holiday, a family carries food hampers and a sake jug. Rice paddies on the right side lead to the Shinto shrine. Cherry blossom, sakura, and maple leaves. The pleasures of sakura, or cherry blossom viewing, or hanami, and picnics during the clear spring weather have always been an important part of Japanese living. inspiring much of the poetry and so forth from all the way back to the late Nara period, early Heian period, you will remember. Paintings of cherry blossoms and maple leaves date back to the mid-Heian period. So the paintings begin in mid. Sakura-inspired poetry, I think, dates earlier than that. Throughout the country, from late March to early May, 50 varieties of cherry trees burst into bloom. It is a signal for hundreds of thousands of Japanese to pack hampers of food and don spring kimonos to go forth and greet these harbingers of summer. The peasant sage Ninomiya wrote, "The well-trod path is covered with fallen leaves. Sweep them aside to view the footprints of the sun goddess." Next page, we have a full image taking up both pages. This is image 101, the Kyoto street scenes screen, or Rakuchu Rakugaizu Byobu. In 1750, Fujiwara Mitsutaka of the Tosa school painted a detailed screen showing life in Kyoto. In this detail from the screen, vassals of the daimyo, the feudal lord, and of samurai parade in the famous Gion festival, the Gion Matsuri in Kyoto. Spectators watch the proceedings from their homes. And the following page, we have image 102, trades and crafts scene, Seigyozu Byobu. And in that image, we see women preparing cotton for spinning using a tool called the kinuta. And you remember the word kinuta appears in a lot of classical waka, kinuta. And you can see the kinuta being used there. Man at the right carries bundles of refined cotton fiber. And on the right side, we see a detail from the same byobu. Using indigo, two men put design on cloth in this detail from a 6-fold screen on country occupations by Hokusai. Arts and artisans. The work of the artisans of Japan was well recorded by artists from the 10th through the 19th centuries. But the most sensitive record of craftsmen practicing their trades was left by Hokusai. I don't know if this is true, that's a debatable assertion. We can discuss the merits of this assertion later, but Hokusai is certainly one of the great craftsmen and artists of Japan, the last great master of the ukiyo-e style painting, who died in 1849, so only 17 years or so, 18 years before the fall of the end of the Tokugawa period. So this is late Edo period that we're in now. So his ukiyo-e are among the most famous ukiyo-e, but always keep in mind that they come from the very last decades of the Edo period. Throughout his long life, which stretched 89 years, he made sketches with amazing facility of the common people of Japan as they went about their daily tasks. His painting was by no means limited to artisans at work. He also revealed the joys and sorrows, poverty and affluence, realism and fantasy in the lives of his subjects. During the years that Hokusai painted artisans, strong guilds called kumiai had developed. These kumiai groups of craftsmen banded together to stabilize prices. The number of members of a guild was strictly limited, and so was the number of apprentices that each master craftsman was allowed. Many of the guilds were under the protection of a powerful patron. The makers of sake had as their protector the Kitano Shinto Shrine, for example. The Gion Shrine in Kyoto exercised control of the workers in cotton. Other groups had as their patrons powerful daimyo or long-established Buddhist temples. Even with the considerable control that existed, the artisan of Japan was able to produce his wares on a highly individual basis. He was the creator, the craftsman, the manufacturer, and usually the seller of his own products. Often an artisan working with his family or apprentices would process the raw silk or cotton by himself, weave it by himself, design and dye it by himself, and offer it for sale by himself. On the next page, we see this large image number 103, of a samurai hunting, Makigari-zu. And here we see hunting reached its peak in the Edo period. At the left of this image, beaters drive deer, boars, and rabbits into an enclosure. On the right side, the animals are met by hunters, how far back the lines are extending to prevent the animals from escaping. And some more images on the next two pages. We have image number 104 and then another detail from that image. Kitchen scenes, it's translated as Daidokuro no Onna. And on the left side, we see two women in intimate kitchen scene by the famous artist Utamaro. One peels vegetables while the other cares for a baby. And on the right side, from the same Nishiki-e, we see a companion print shows fire making. Girl in the foreground blows coals. The other girl, getting smoke in her eyes, uses a ladle. The birth of the metropolis. And we see a very large image here with number 105, a bird's eye view of Edo. Edo Hitomezu is the Japanese title. And in this image we see a bird's eye view of the city of Edo, which is of course later to be named Tokyo, showing rivers, bridges, and the Chiyoda Castle on the right, as well as Mount Fuji in the background. Around a small fortress in East Japan, a small village was established. Like Rome, it had 7 hills. So this is the birth of Edo it's talking about now. Between and surrounding them was desolate lowlands and marshes. From 1457 until the end of the 16th century, it remained a quiet agricultural and fishing hamlet. So the great metropolis of Edo was nothing no more than a hamlet in those years leading up to the 17th century. Then, suddenly, Tokugawa Ieyasu received this little hamlet from Hideyoshi. It was part of the 8 provinces of the Kanto region that Ieyasu won as a reward in battle. The town was called Edo, and Ieyasu made it his capital of Japan in 1603. This little hamlet, called Edo, was later renamed Tokyo, of course, the eastern capital. When the shogun moved to the new capital, named Edo, with his thousands of retainers, he was followed by artisans, tradesmen, and servants to supply the needs of the affluent ruling class. Builders and carpenters were imported by the hundreds to construct homes for the 250 feudal lords ordered by the shogun to keep their families in Edo as hostages. This is, of course, known as the Sankin Kodai system. Discuss this in more detail in class. An extensive area known as Yoshiwara, the nightless city, was set aside where licensed prostitutes, or yujo, courtesans, entertained wealthy merchants, artists, artisans, and writers. Almost overnight, the village became a city. Bridges spanned the many creeks and rivers, and over them moved an unending stream of humanity. Within the first 100 years, Edo reached a population of 500,000, and by 1787, underline this, it had increased to 1.3 million citizens living in the city. It was well on its way to becoming the world's largest city. Moving on, next page, we have image 106 at the top. This is the fireworks on the Sumida River in Edo, Edo Sumidagawa Hanamizu. In that little depiction, we see fireworks show on River Sumida in Edo. It is probable that fireworks caused some of the devastating fires. And on the right side, we see this large image. It is the Kaji Emaki, or Edo fire scroll. And there we see Japan's greatest city was destroyed by fire numerous times. Here, firemen place white standards to show the center of the fire. The firefighters of Edo. Firefighting was an important part of the daily life of most men of Edo. By the year 1858, they lived in a city as big as London, with houses built entirely of wood and paper. Oil lanterns were in use throughout the city. Cooking was done on open charcoal braziers, or hibachi in Japanese, and fireworks were a regular entertainment, hanabi, fireworks. This incendiary combination gave rise to numerous devastating fires. Every block had its firefighting company. Each company carried its own standard, a distinctive cloth decoration on a long pole. And you see these standards depicted here in this image. Membership in a brigade was handed down from father to son. When a fire started, the signal was given by a fire watcher who climbed a ladder to strike the fire gong. Firemen raced to the scene of the conflagration. Upon reaching the blaze, the man carrying the standard climbed as near as possible to the center of the flames and directed the efforts of their company. The standard identified each brigade so they could be rewarded later. In spite of the energy and bravery of the firemen, the annual loss by fire in Edo was staggering. Every merchant put money aside each year for rebuilding, knowing someday that he too would be burned out. Next page, we have at the top, image 108, entertainment of the Shitaya restaurant, title in Japanese, Edo Komyo Kaite Zukushi. And there we see the famous restaurant Kawachido was located at present Ueno Park. The scene here shows geishas from the demimon, from the yukaka, the gay quarters, the pleasure quarters, entertaining male customers and diners. At the bottom, we see image 109. The view of the Echigoya dry goods store in Edo. Uki-e Surugacho go Fukuya-zu is the title in Japanese. And there we see the interior of the Echigoya shop, showing customers' shoes on the floors, clerks and customers seated on tatami mats. Underline Echigoya shop. This is a very important shop in the Edo period, and it would go on, I think, to become the Mitsukoshi department store that we see everywhere today. And on the right side, we see image 110, the exterior of the Echigoya shop. The same Echigoya shop is depicted here, the Edo Surugacho Echigoya Honten no Zu. Besides temples and shrines, long arcades of shops developed. Most were little more than stalls from 6 to 10 feet wide and perhaps 10 to 15 feet deep. The fronts were open to the street and allowed every passerby a full view of articles for sale and the craftsmen. As the city of Edo prospered, it became the shopping center of Japan, and certain regions became became known for special kinds of articles. Some streets were devoted largely to selling decorations and paper goods, others to religious articles. Some specialized in books, others were bright with the color of woodblock prints. But in the fast-growing Ginza, the Ginza district, of course you are familiar with this area, many of you have already been there. The Ginza district, a word which originally meant minting, as in coin minting, for early coins were stamped in this section of Tokyo. Shops of every type were jumbled together. Shops selling umbrellas, sandals and clogs, kimono, lanterns, fans, and seals lined both sides of the wide roadway. Merchants, the shonin, shi no kousho, who were supposed to be at the bottom, but now have risen at least to the above the peasants. The merchants, shonin, became prosperous during the Edo period, for the families of the rich daimyo were held as hostages and did all of their shopping within the city. Due to the patronage of this rich clientele, larger and more exclusive stores developed. Some, like the Echigoya draper's shop that I just mentioned, a favorite of the elite, were to become the great department stores of the future. So kind of prototype for Mitsukoshi, if not the origin of it. Image 111, this is a world map. Sekai Bangkok Nihon Yori Kaijo Risu Ojo Jinboku-zu. And in this map of the world, we see a map drawn just before the arrival of Matthew Perry, Commodore Matthew Perry from the U.S. Navy, showing a lack of geographical knowledge. So it's a pretty wonky Sekai Chizu. And Japan is shown in the upper left corner. Doesn't really correspond to the actual geography of Earth. The Japanese world. The 265 years of sakoku, or isolation, had a predictable effect upon Japan's lack of knowledge of the outside world. Before the country was closed, a few scholars and seamen had learned something about the size and shape of the Earth from the Portuguese. But the Portuguese were expelled by 1638, and the great mass of the Japanese people learned little of geography from the isolated enclave of Dutchmen. The earliest maps of Japan mirrored the distorted world view as interpreted by 17th century cartographers working from limited Portuguese knowledge. Later maps, although more realistic, indicated countries of one-eyed monsters, dwarfs, a nation of Amazon women, and other strangely populated countries. Beliefs of this kind had been spread hundreds of years earlier by Marco Polo and Sir John Mandeville, whose tales about fantastic distant lands had been known to the Spanish and Portuguese explorers, and which continued to appear on some Japanese maps until the middle of the 19th century. When Japan isolated itself from the world, it depended for its security upon a sea around it. But during the generations of isolation, first clipper ships, then steamships, and new knowledge of navigation and geography were drawing the world closer together and making the islands of Japan more vulnerable. Toward the middle of the 19th century, the nation finally realized that it had put too much faith in the protection afforded by the sea, that instead of a bulwark against attack, every port was vulnerable to modern ships and armaments. And it is that vulnerability to foreign attack that we will start with in the next chapter, which is the transition period, the 15 years between 1853 and 1868, leading up to the Meiji period, which will constitute the final chapter of this book. We will discuss more about the Edo period history and its art in class, and I will see you then. Goodbye.